Welcome, history lovers. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most devastating pandemics the world has ever seen, the Black Death. Spanning continents and changing the course of history, this deadly plague reshaped societies, economies, and the very fabric of medieval life. If you're fascinated by history and want to uncover the mysteries of the past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our epic journeys through time. Now, let's step back into the 14th century and explore the chilling story of the Black Death.
In the early 1300s, the world moved at a gentle rhythm. Villages lay scattered across soft green fields, and narrow dirt paths wound calmly between them. The sound of wooden wheels creaking over stone roads, the soft bleating of sheep moving across slopes, and the distant ring of a church bell shaped the everyday world of medieval life. People rose with the sun and slept with the stars. They shared stories at long wooden tables, warmed their homes with simple fires, and worked the same earth their ancestors had tended for generations. Life was predictable, not easy, but steady. Seasons changed slowly, and with them came familiar tasks: planting, harvesting, repairing, resting. Far from these peaceful villages, immense trade routes stretched across continents. Along the Silk Road, travelers carried silk, spices, furs, and metals. Caravans moved like patient shadows across deserts, and ships gently rocked in distant harbors, pulled by the steady rhythm of tides. No one noticed the tiny passengers hiding in the corners of wagons and ships, the fleas, the rodents, and the quiet carriers of something unknown. Life continued without alarm. Farmers guided their animals, merchants weighed their goods, and children played beneath the warm glow of afternoon light. Winter arrived and melted into spring. Harvests rose and fell, small kingdoms.
As the peaceful rhythm of medieval life continued, the world turned quietly beneath the sky. Days blended softly into one another, shaped by gentle routines and familiar sounds. Yet far away, beyond the mountains and the winding rivers, the first small ripples of change had already begun to form. In the distant regions of Central Asia, where vast grasslands stretched toward the horizon like an endless sea, traders moved steadily across ancient routes. Their caravans carried goods, stories, and hopes for profit. But along with their treasures, they unknowingly carried something else, something too small for any eye to notice, yet powerful enough to change the fate of millions. Little by little, the sickness spread in scattered pockets, moving from settlement to settlement. A caravan might arrive in a bustling market, its wheels coated with dust from a month-long journey. Merchants greeted one another with warm smiles, exchanging coins, fabrics, and spices. But neither they nor the crowds around them realized that hidden among the sacks of grain and swirls of cloth were small creatures, rodents that carried fleas, and fleas that carried a silent threat. Across the horizon, ships prepared to leave distant ports, their sails swelling with the evening wind. Sailors walked across wooden decks, tightening ropes and securing crates. Below their feet, in the dim spaces between barrels and beams, more stowaways traveled quietly. The sailors thought only of their destination, a new harbor, a new market, another chance to earn their living. None could imagine that the true passengers on board were not the crew nor the cargo, but the tiny, unseen carriers of an illness that had not yet shown its true form. Back in Europe, life remained calm. Villagers gathered by their hearths, telling stories passed down through generations. Monks in quiet.
As another day unfolded across the medieval world, the morning light spread softly across fields, forests, and winding rivers. Dew shimmered on blades of grass, and a gentle mist lingered in valleys before slowly rising into the warming air. Life continued as it always had, calm, slow, and shaped by the comforting rhythm of daily tasks. In small villages, the first sounds of the morning filled the air, the clatter of wooden buckets at wells, the quiet murmur of voices greeting another day, and the distant rhythmic thud of a blacksmith's hammer striking heated metal. Markets began to stir as merchants arranged their goods with practiced care, placing fruits, cloth, and handcrafted items in neat rows. The world felt familiar, grounded, and safe. But far beyond these everyday scenes, something continued to shift. Along distant trade routes, caravans pressed steadily onward. Their wheels creaked over rugged terrain, guided by the steady steps of camels, horses, and pack animals. Merchants spoke of profits and fortunes, never suspecting that the most influential thing they carried was not silk or spices, but tiny fleas hidden in the fur of rodents nestled quietly in their cargo. At every stop, a roadside shelter, a bustling town, a quiet nomadic encampment, the sickness moved just a little further. Not loudly, not violently, but gently, almost politely, as though it wished not to disturb the quiet world it was slowly changing. Months passed in this subtle way, with the illness spreading softly like a whisper shared between distant lands. A small village might fall strangely quiet, prompting stories of a fever that moved quicker than anyone expected. But these stories remained far away, drifting through the world like scattered leaves carried by a breeze. To people living hundreds of miles away, they sounded like nothing more than rumors. Ships continued to glide across calm seas, their sails catching the wind as crews worked. As days folded softly into weeks, the calm rhythm of medieval life remained undisturbed. Europe exhaled in quiet harmony, unaware that somewhere, far beyond its familiar horizons, a slow and steady tide was approaching. A tide without waves, without sound, without warning, yet one that would soon touch its shores. Across the Mediterranean Sea, merchant ships drifted toward Europe's bustling ports. Their wooden hulls creaked gently as they cut through the water, guided by experienced sailors who watched the stars at night and the winds by day. These ships carried fabrics, spices, grain, metals, and precious goods gathered from distant lands. They represented trade, prosperity, and connection. But deep within the dark corners of their lower decks, something else moved. Small rodents found warmth among coils of rope and stored food. Fleas clung to their fur, carrying something no one could see, no one could sense, and no one could predict. As the ships neared Europe, the tiny carriers neared it as well. In the port cities, life was lively and full of color. Markets bustled with voices, the smell of salt hung in the air, and fishermen mended their nets while waves lapped against stone piers. Children chased each other between wooden crates, stacked high with goods from distant lands. Merchants prepared to greet the arriving ships, eager for fresh cargo and new profits. Not a single person imagined that within these ships rested the beginnings of one of history's greatest and most devastating chapters. When the first ships finally reached Europe's coast, their arrival was like any other. Dock workers secured thick ropes to heavy posts. Merchants climbed aboard to inspect goods. Sailors stretched their legs after long weeks at sea. no one noticed the slight increase of rodents scurrying across the docks, moving from ship to land as effortlessly as shadows slipping into the evening. The transition was quiet, ordinary.
The early signs of change were so gentle, so scattered, that they barely disturbed the peaceful rhythm of everyday life. In the port towns where ships had recently arrived, the morning still began in familiar ways. Fishermen hauling nets glistening with seawater, merchants opening their stalls, and townsfolk greeting each other with soft nods beneath the rising sun. Yet within this ordinary bustle, small moments hinted at something unusual. A sailor who had returned only days earlier from a long voyage complained of a sudden fever collapsing near the docks. His friends carried him home, believing he had simply worked too hard or eaten spoiled food on the journey. They wrapped him in blankets and whispered prayers for his recovery. Nearby, in a narrow street lined with wooden homes, a merchant's wife noticed swelling beneath her arm, a painful lump she tried to ignore as she prepared her family's morning meal. She assumed it was the result of lifting heavy crates or stirring large pots. The idea of sickness, especially something dangerous, never crossed her mind. From house to house, tiny, isolated symptoms began to appear. A child developed a strange chill that refused to fade. A dock worker struggled with sudden exhaustion. A traveler complained of dark blotches forming beneath his skin. Each case seemed unrelated, a coincidence, an unfortunate moment in the unpredictable rhythm of life. But these were not coincidences, not separate events. They were threads of a story beginning to weave itself through the fabric of Europe. The rodents that had escaped from the anchored ships had spread into warehouses, taverns, and market stalls. Their fleas, hungry and unseen, found new hosts with ease. All around the port cities, the sickness was quietly, patiently finding its way into homes and hearts. Still, life appeared calm. The church bells rang on schedule, echoing softly across rooftops. Markets filled with voices. Children played in streets dusted with sunlight. Farmers arrived with carts full of fresh produce. As the days drifted forward, the changes in the port towns grew slightly more noticeable, though still gentle enough that most people continued their routines without much fear. Life, after all, had always been unpredictable. Sicknesses came and went, storms rose and faded, and people trusted in their resilience to carry them through. But the quiet presence that now lingered in the air was unlike the familiar illnesses of the past. In narrow, winding streets, where merchants once called out prices with lively energy, voices softened. A few stalls remained closed longer than usual, their owners tending to sudden sickness at home. Neighbors exchanged glances when they noticed yet another household pulling shutters closed midday. Still, no one panicked. They believed this strange wave of illness would soon pass, just as many before it had. Inside the homes of the sick, however, the situation felt subtly different. A mother held her child close, noticing the heat radiating from his skin. She whispered soothing words, humming lullabies to keep him calm. But each hour she saw new signs, darkened spots forming beneath the skin, swelling growing in tender places, breathing becoming shallow and uneven. She prayed silently, hoping the morning would bring strength. In another part of the city, a fisherman sat on a simple wooden stool, gripping his side as pains surged through him. His wife dabbed his forehead with cool water, whispering that he only needed rest, but fear flickered behind her eyes. She had seen neighbors fall ill with similar symptoms, each progressing with unsettling speed. Despite these growing concerns, the the rhythm of daily life continued. People returned to work. Fishermen still ventured out upon calm seas. Markets opened, though with fewer voices carrying through the air. Bells rang from church towers, calling townsfolk to prayer, where they gathered in clusters, seeking comfort and guidance. No one knew that gathering together would allow the sickness to spread faster. The fleas, tiny and unnoticed, leapt from person to person, from clothing to skin, feeding quietly and moving on. They traveled along sleeves, onto blankets, into beds, onto children's clothes. In the port towns where life had always followed a gentle and predictable rhythm, something subtle began to shift. It was not loud or sudden. It did not arrive with alarms or proclamations. Instead, it settled softly into the spaces between daily routines, a quiet tension, a fragile silence, a lingering uncertainty that people tried to ignore. The mornings still looked peaceful, shopkeepers sweeping their doorsteps, fishermen unloading their catch, bakers placing warm loaves along wooden shelves. Yet beneath this familiar surface, townsfolk exchanged more cautious glances. Conversations drifted in hushed tones, carrying questions no one quite knew how to answer. Have you heard of the sickness on Harbor Street? They say the merchant's son grew ill overnight. A neighbor collapsed just 2 days ago. They spoke softly, as though worried that speaking too loudly might invite the illness closer. Inside homes, the atmosphere was different from the streets. Families gathered near small fires, their faces lit by the warm, flickering glow. They tried to reassure one another, reminding themselves of past fevers, past hardships, past illnesses that had come and gone. But this one felt different. It moved faster, it struck harder, and it left little room for hope. In one small house near the edge of the city, a father sat beside his daughter, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. She had been healthy only days earlier, full of laughter and sunlight. Now she slept restlessly, her skin warm with fever, dark spots forming beneath her delicate skin. Her father held her hand, whispering that she would soon be well again, though deep inside he felt the tremor of fear. Across town, a healer was called to more homes than usual. Her feet carried her over cobblestone paths as she moved from one patient to the next. Each home told the same quiet story. Fever that...
By now, the first whispers of sickness had begun to ripple beyond the port towns, moving quietly into the surrounding countryside. What had seemed like isolated cases was starting to show a faint, troubling pattern. Families noticed neighbors falling ill, villages grew quieter, and even the strongest and healthiest began to feel a subtle unease in the air. In the fields, farmers paused from their work to check on a family member who had suddenly developed a high fever. Shepherds returned from guiding their flocks, finding that one of their children was weak and pale. The sickness had spread faster than anyone could explain, moving from house to house along the winding paths that connected communities. At the same time, townsfolk began to notice another disturbing symptom: the dark, swollen lumps that appeared under the arms, in the groin, or on the neck. They were unfamiliar, frightening, and impossible to ignore. Healers tried their remedies, herbs, poultices, prayers, yet the illness seemed resistant to every attempt. Each case added to the growing tension, the quiet fear that the townspeople could neither name nor fully understand. The plague did not roar through the streets, but moved silently, patiently, like shadows creeping across familiar landscapes. It found hosts easily in homes, in inns, in market stalls crowded with people trading goods, stories, and news. Fleas, small and unseen, carried it from one human to another, while rats spread it through barns and storerooms. No wall, no distance, no careful measure could entirely stop its advance. Despite the growing sickness, daily life continued as best it could. The church bells still called the faithful.
As the Black Death settled into the port towns, its quiet presence began to reach further into the countryside. Villages connected by winding dirt roads, rivers, and forest paths started to notice the faint signs of illness. At first, it was subtle. A farmer staying in bed longer than usual, a child refusing breakfast, a neighbor asking for herbs or prayers. But the pattern was growing, like ripples spreading outward across still water. In the fields, the work continued, though with a hushed undertone. Farmers plowed the soil, gathered the harvest, and tended their livestock, all while keeping one eye on the neighbors' houses. Every cough, every pale face, every unexplained swelling brought a flicker of worry. People whispered to each other. Soft conversations passed under breath, trying not to summon the plague with their words. Healers and midwives were busier than ever. They moved quietly from home to home, their hands gentle, their voices calm, their presence a source of comfort in a world suddenly filled with uncertainty. They applied poultices, brewed teas, and murmured prayers. Still, they could not stop the illness, and the number of those affected grew slowly but steadily. Animals, too, played their part in the unseen chain. Rats and mice traveled along barns, stables, and granaries. Fleas, imperceptible to the human eye, moved from host to host, carrying the silent threat further into communities that had never known sickness of this kind. In towns, marketplaces became quieter. Merchants placed their goods carefully, avoiding unnecessary contact. Children played closer to home, their laughter quieter than usual. People began to keep to themselves, sensing that the air had changed. Heavy, uncertain, charged with a sense of invisible presence. Evenings took on a stillness that had not been common before. Families gathered around fires, speaking softly and sparingly. Windows were closed earlier, doors kept shut. Those who had fallen ill were tended with gentle care, while the healthy moved cautiously around them. The rhythm of life continued, but it had slowed, and a new awareness hung over every activity. The Black Death moved onward, patient and invisible, carrying its weight silently across the countryside. It touched the homes of the wealthy and the poor alike, the strong and the weak. Nothing and no one could fully halt its advance. Europe had entered a new chapter, one of slow, pervasive change, where every step and every decision would be influenced by the quiet but relentless presence of the plague. The first wave was spreading, hour by hour, and the rhythm of life was beginning to bend under its subtle power.
By now, the presence of the Black Death was no longer a whisper. It had quietly, inexorably, moved from the port towns into villages and small communities, touching lives in ways that could not be ignored. The first wave had begun to settle in, and even the most resilient families were beginning to feel its weight. In the morning light, villagers moved with a new caution. Farmers rose early, but paused at the edge of their fields to observe neighbors' homes for signs of illness. Shepherds guided their flocks slowly, keeping an eye on fellow travelers along the paths. Children, once free to wander and play, now remained closer to home, their voices quieter than before, almost as if sensing the invisible presence that had entered their world. Healers worked tirelessly, moving from house to house, offering herbs and comfort. Their steps were steady, their hands gentle, their voices calm. But despite their efforts, more people began to fall ill. Families huddled together, whispering prayers and holding their loved ones tightly. Every cough, every sudden fever, every darkened swelling became a sign that the sickness was near. The marketplace, once filled with chatter and the scent of fresh bread and fruit, grew quieter. Merchants placed goods carefully, minimizing contact. People purchased only what was necessary, retreating quickly to the safety of their homes. The rhythm of trade slowed, and the familiar sounds of commerce were replaced by hushed voices and footsteps that carried across empty streets. Stories of illness traveled faster than the disease itself. Travelers spoke of neighbors suddenly taken ill. Wandering merchants told tales of entire households succumbing overnight. The sense of fear spread along with the plague, carried in whispers and worried glances, yet no one knew how to stop it or why it had arrived. Even in this growing fear, the cycle of life continued. Sunlight still warmed the fields, streams still flowed gently through valleys, and birds still sang in the trees. But the air itself seemed heavier, filled with anticipation, a quiet tension that settled in every home and every corner of the village. By night, the villages had taken on an eerie stillness. Fires flickered behind closed doors. Families sat quietly, tending to the sick and murmuring words of hope and prayer. Some dared to step outside briefly, feeling the cool night air, yet they returned quickly, uneasy about the unseen danger surrounding them. The Black Death was no longer distant. It had arrived in full, subtle force. The towns and villages were caught between the familiar rhythm of life and the slow, persistent intrusion of something far beyond human understanding. Every household, every path, every field was touched, even lightly, by its invisible hand. And as the world slept beneath a calm, starry sky, the plague continued its patient journey. Slowly, hour by hour, it moved further into Europe, softening the sounds of everyday life, quieting laughter, and marking the beginning of one of history's darkest and most transformative periods.
By this hour, the Black Death had become more than a quiet presence. It was now a tangible part of life. Villages, once bustling with activity, had slowed to a careful pace. People moved through streets and fields with caution, observing subtle signs of illness in neighbors and travelers alike. The rhythm of daily life was still present, but it had softened, slowed, and become deliberate. Families kept their distance from each other in ways that felt unnatural. Doors were closed, windows shuttered, and even friendly greetings were exchanged with hesitation. Those who had not yet fallen ill watched the sick with careful eyes, unsure of what might come next. Every cough, every fever, every dark swelling was a reminder that life had shifted, quietly but profoundly. Healers and caregivers became central figures in communities. They moved gently from home to home, offering remedies and solace. Their presence was both comforting and solemn, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing power of the sickness. No words could fully ease the worry that settled over families, but their hands, steady and kind, offered some measure of reassurance. Even in this uncertainty, the natural world continued its gentle cycles. The wind moved softly through the trees, rivers flowed steadily over stones worn smooth by centuries. The sun rose and set, painting the sky with familiar hues of gold and violet. Birds continued to sing, and animals grazed quietly in fields that seemed emptier than before. Markets, once the center of communal life, had become quieter still. Merchants displayed their goods with care, minimizing contact with customers. Villagers purchased only what was necessary, retreating quickly to the safety of their homes. The familiar rhythm of trade had slowed, and the usual chatter of towns was replaced by hushed conversations and the occasional worried whisper. As night fell, the stillness deepened. Families gathered near the warmth of fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow. They whispered prayers, offered words of comfort, and held their loved ones close. The fear of the unseen, the invisible force that had entered their lives, hung quietly in every corner of the home. The plague moved silently through the countryside, carried on the bodies of fleas, in the fur of rodents, and along the paths of human contact. Its presence was relentless, spreading hour by hour, reaching households and villages that had thought themselves untouched. And yet, in this hour, there was still resilience. People adapted. They learned to move more carefully, to care for one another while protecting themselves, to continue life in a world that had shifted almost imperceptibly but significantly. The first wave was no longer a distant threat. It was here, in homes, in streets, and hearts. Europe had entered a new reality, one in which life and death moved closely together, quietly and inescapably. The Black Death had begun its quiet transformation of the continent, hour by hour, home by home, step by step. And as the night deepened, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what the next day would bring.
By this hour, the Black Death had moved deeply into villages, towns, and countryside alike. Its presence was no longer a subtle rumor. It was a tangible, quiet reality. Communities that had once been filled with lively markets, festivals, and gatherings were now slower, quieter, and measured in every movement. The familiar rhythm of daily life had shifted, replaced by careful observation and gentle precaution. Families adapted in small but significant ways. Meals were shared in smaller groups, with those who were healthy separated from those who were sick. Children were kept close, under watchful eyes, their play confined to nearby yards and gardens. Even the sounds of laughter seemed softer, more deliberate, as though the air itself had learned to hold its breath. Healers continued to move steadily among the sick, offering remedies, comfort, and instruction. They taught families how to care gently for those afflicted. Warm blankets, soothing teas, careful attention, all while trying to minimize the risk of spreading the illness further. Their presence became a quiet reassurance, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, small acts of care could offer light. In villages, marketplaces had transformed. Merchants displayed goods in the quietest corners, with fewer people venturing out to buy or trade. Long conversations were replaced by brief exchanges. The usual music, chatter, and clatter were replaced by measured steps and whispered voices. Life continued, but in a slower, more deliberate way, as though every action had to be weighed and considered. Travelers carried the plague along winding roads, through forests and over hills, spreading it further with each step. Yet, even as the sickness moved silently, people learned to adapt. Villages began to establish simple boundaries, avoiding close contact with neighboring households when illness appeared. Paths were chosen carefully. Gatherings were limited. Precaution became woven into the daily rhythm, gently but persistently. Evenings grew quieter. Fires glowed in small cottages, casting a warm light on faces lined with worry and fatigue. Families whispered prayers, shared stories,
and comforted one another. The nights carried a gentle weight, a reminder that while the Black Death had arrived, life still continued, and with it, the resilience of human spirit. The natural world carried on alongside these human struggles. Birds sang in the trees, streams flowed over rocks, and the wind brushed softly across open fields. These familiar rhythms offered a small measure of calm, a reminder that the world itself continued, even as people faced something they could neither see nor control. By now, it was clear. The Black Death was no longer a distant shadow. It had settled among communities, reshaping life quietly but irrevocably. Every hour brought new challenges, small acts of care and subtle adaptations. The familiar patterns of life had changed, and Europe was learning to move forward in this new, quiet reality, hour by hour, day by day, step by step.
By now, the Black Death had firmly embedded itself into the lives of towns and villages. Communities had begun to change in response to the silent, unrelenting spread of the sickness. Homes became places of careful isolation, and families learned to navigate a new rhythm of life, one shaped by caution, care, and observation. Villagers rose each morning with a quiet vigilance. Parents checked on their children, observing every sign of fatigue, pallor, or swelling. Farmers tended their fields with steady hands, but paused frequently to monitor neighbors and travelers passing along the paths. Every interaction was measured. Every gesture, gentle and careful, carried a weight of awareness. Healers moved from home to home in slow, deliberate rhythm. Their knowledge of herbs, poultices, and prayers offered comfort, even if it could not fully stop the illness. They instructed families in small practices: keep the sick warm, allow them to rest, avoid unnecessary contact, and maintain cleanliness where possible. These measures were simple, yet in this quiet, methodical approach, people found a sense of control amidst uncertainty. Marketplaces were hushed. Stalls remained partially empty as villagers purchased only essentials. Conversations were brief, voices low. The familiar energy of trade had been replaced by deliberate calm. Life continued, but with a softened pace, a new gentleness to every step. Travelers carried news as well as the disease. Word of sudden fevers, dark swellings, and unexpected deaths spread quietly from village to village. Each story added to the awareness of an invisible presence, shaping how people moved, spoke, and cared for one another. Evenings took on a solemn calm. Families gathered by the fireside, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of flames. They whispered prayers, shared gentle words of comfort, and tended to the sick with patient hands. The night itself seemed quieter, almost reverent, as if it acknowledged the unseen presence moving silently among them. In the countryside, paths were less traveled. Villagers moved carefully, aware that every step could carry risk. But the natural world remained unchanged. Streams flowed steadily, birds sang softly in the trees, and winds brushed gently across the fields. These constant rhythms offered a quiet reassurance, a reminder that life, in some form, continued. The Black Death persisted in silence, hour by hour. Its presence shaped human behavior, creating a careful, watchful community that adapted in small but meaningful ways. Fear lingered, but alongside it, resilience grew. Families learned to navigate a world changed, finding strength in quiet observation, gentle care, and the small comforts of everyday life. Europe had entered a period of slow, pervasive transformation. The familiar patterns of life had shifted, yet people found ways to continue, hour by hour, step by step, in the shadow of a silent, relentless force.
By now, the Black Death had spread from villages into the larger towns and cities, moving quietly but inexorably along streets and through crowded neighborhoods. The familiar hum of urban life was now tempered with caution and unease. Markets, once filled with the scents of baked bread and spices, were quieter. Merchants arranged their goods carefully, greeting customers with gentle nods rather than the usual lively chatter. In narrow alleys, children played less openly. Their laughter, once frequent and carefree, now echoed softly against stone walls, subdued and thoughtful. Families remained closer together, often keeping the sick in a separate room or corner, doing their best to care for them while maintaining a cautious distance. Healers, who had already become central to village life, now moved steadily through the urban streets. Their presence was both a reassurance and a reminder of the plague's persistent reach. Herbs were applied, poultices laid carefully, and prayers whispered for those who were sick. Their calm, deliberate movements became a quiet rhythm amidst the otherwise tense and subdued city life. The Black Death moved quietly, but efficiently. Fleas moved from person to person, rats scuttled through the nooks and crannies of houses, and trade routes carried the unseen sickness further into the heart of towns. No neighborhood was entirely untouched, yet life continued with cautious determination. Evenings brought a strange, almost reverent stillness to the streets. Lanterns glowed softly, illuminating the cobblestones, while families gathered indoors around warm fires. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of those who had recovered, of neighbors who had fallen ill, and of the strategies they used to care for one another. The night was quiet, yet heavy with the unspoken presence of the plague. In this hour, communities began to adapt more fully. Rules and habits, once informal, now became essential. Households limited contact with neighbors, travelers were greeted with caution, and social gatherings were reduced or abandoned. Life continued, but it was measured, deliberate, and cautious. Nature remained a quiet witness. The wind rustled gently through the trees, rivers flowed steadily, and the distant cry of birds offered a soft reminder that some rhythms of the world remained unchanged. Even amidst fear and uncertainty, these natural sounds brought a quiet comfort to the people navigating the new reality of their lives. The Black Death moved on, hour by hour, leaving a lasting impact on the city, shaping both behavior and community. And yet, amid this shadow, small acts of care, resilience, and cautious adaptation continued to shape the survival of life, human, animal, and natural, in the world around it. As the Black Death continued to move quietly through cities and villages, communities began to find ways to adapt. Life did not stop, but it had changed its rhythm. People moved more deliberately, spoke more softly, and attended to daily tasks with care and mindfulness, aware that every action could affect themselves or others. Families organized themselves to minimize contact. Those who were healthy helped tend to the sick from a distance, bringing food, water, and warmth without lingering too close. Children learned to stay within sight of caregivers, their routines adjusted to ensure safety while still allowing small moments of play and curiosity. Even in fear, the bonds between family members strengthened, with care and attention becoming central to survival. Healers and midwives became the quiet anchors of communities. Their gentle hands and calm voices offered reassurance in homes that might otherwise have been filled with panic. Each remedy applied, each herb brewed, each prayer whispered, was a small, deliberate act of hope and resilience. Though they could not stop the plague, they taught families how to navigate it, hour by hour, step by step. In towns, marketplaces slowly adjusted. Merchants arranged goods more carefully, keeping distance from customers. Villagers purchased necessities, but the casual mingling of life had changed into deliberate, cautious exchanges. Social life contracted, and even simple conversations were quieter, slower, and more measured. Yet this adaptation allowed daily life to continue in a world dominated by fear and uncertainty. The plague itself moved silently, unrelenting. Fleas, rats, and human movement carried it further into the heart of Europe. But the human response created small barriers. Isolation, careful care, and deliberate movement slowed its progress in some areas. Communities learned, gradually, to coexist with the invisible presence around them, balancing daily life with caution and awareness. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection and gentle care. Fires glowed warmly in homes, families whispered softly, and the night carried a calm tension. People learned to find moments of comfort amid uncertainty: a child's laughter, the smell of fresh bread, the flicker of a candle flame. The natural world continued its cycles, offering stability amidst change. Rivers flowed steadily, winds rustled leaves, and stars remained constant in the sky. These enduring rhythms reminded communities that life, in all its forms, continued even under the shadow of the plague. Hour by hour, Europe moved through this slow transformation. Fear, loss, and uncertainty were constants, but so too were adaptation, resilience, and the quiet strength of humanity. Life persisted, and people learned to navigate their new reality, one careful step at a time, carrying hope in their hearts, even as the shadow of the Black Death stretched across the continent.
By this hour, the Black Death had touched nearly every corner of towns and villages. Families faced the quiet weight of loss. Homes that once held laughter and warmth now sometimes held emptiness or the subdued presence of grief. Though the plague moved silently, its effects were unmistakable. Households shrank, neighbors disappeared, and familiar routines were forever altered. Mourning became a part of daily life. Families gathered quietly to remember those who had passed, lighting small candles or murmuring prayers. Even in the depth of sorrow, there was care. Those left behind supported one another, sharing food, water, and comfort with neighbors who had suffered losses of their own. Grief moved softly through communities, a shared rhythm binding people together in ways both gentle and profound. Despite the sadness, life continued in measured, deliberate ways. Fields still required tending, animals still needed care, and bread still had to be baked. Families, guided by resilience and necessity, adapted their routines. Work moved at a quieter pace, with careful attention to safety, and every action was carried out with thoughtfulness born from necessity. Healers and caregivers became more essential than ever. Their quiet presence, gentle words, and methodical attention offered a steadying hand in a world shaken by invisible forces. Each application of herbs, each poultice, each whispered prayer was a small act of resistance against despair, a reminder that even amid the plague, life continued. Markets and town streets remained subdued. Merchants arranged goods carefully, interactions were brief, and gatherings were minimized. Yet trade and daily life persisted in small, deliberate ways, allowing the community to maintain a fragile continuity in a disrupted world. People learned to navigate this altered reality with patience, caution, and care. Evenings brought reflective quiet. Fires glowed softly, casting warm light over thoughtful faces. Families shared gentle conversations, recounted memories of those lost, and spoke of hope for the future. Children, while shielded from some of the fear around them, began to understand that life could be both fragile and resilient. Nature continued its steady rhythm alongside human adaptation. Rivers flowed, winds whispered through trees, and stars shone consistently overhead. These enduring patterns offered comfort, a reminder that while life could be interrupted, it was not extinguished. Hour by hour, the Black Death shaped Europe quietly, leaving behind loss, reflection, and transformation. Communities adapted, individuals endured, and the gentle persistence of life continued, even in the shadow of one of history's greatest plagues.
Europe had entered a new rhythm, shaped quietly by the presence of the Black Death. Communities had learned to adapt, to move carefully, and to care for one another while navigating the unseen dangers around them. Life continued, though slower, gentler, and more deliberate than before. Families rose in the morning with cautious attentiveness. Parents checked on their children, monitored neighbors from a safe distance, and planned each day with thoughtfulness. Small tasks, feeding animals, tending crops, baking bread, were approached with a quiet patience, a deliberate care born of necessity. Every action carried weight, but it also carried hope. Healers, now central figures in every community, moved steadily through homes and streets. Their work combined knowledge, compassion, and calm observation. They applied remedies, taught families how to care for the sick, and whispered prayers that offered comfort even when the outcome was uncertain. Their presence reminded people that even in difficult times, care and attention could make a difference. Markets and town streets had adapted to the new reality. Merchants displayed goods with careful attention, interactions were brief, and large gatherings were rare. Yet, life persisted, measured in small steps, deliberate movements and soft voices. Communities had discovered a resilience that was quiet, persistent, and shared among neighbors. Evenings became moments of reflection and togetherness. Families gathered around fires, sharing stories, memories, and soft words of encouragement. They tended to the sick, comforted one another, and found small ways to maintain warmth and connection in a world that had grown uncertain. Nature remained a constant companion. Rivers flowed steadily, wind whispered through the trees, and stars shone brightly in the night sky. These gentle patterns reminded people that life continued even as they faced challenges beyond their understanding. The Black Death had transformed Europe, hour by hour, village by village, town by town. Yet in this shadow, humanity endured. People adapted, communities held together, and quiet resilience became the rhythm of survival. Though the plague was far from gone, Europe had begun to learn how to move forward, slowly, gently, and with care, step by step, hour by hour.
As the hours moved forward, the Black Death had become a persistent presence in Europe, shaping the rhythm of daily life in subtle but profound ways. Communities, while still cautious and vigilant, began to find delicate balance between fear and the continuity of living. The shadow of the plague lingered, yet life adapted, hour by hour, step by step. Families organized themselves carefully. Those who were healthy helped care for the sick, often from a distance, offering warmth, food, and water without close contact. Children remained close to home, guided by watchful eyes, yet still allowed moments of quiet play and exploration within safe boundaries. These small routines created a sense of stability amidst the uncertainty. Healers continued their essential work, moving steadily through villages and towns. Each herb, poultice, and whispered prayer was an act of gentle resistance,
Their presence brought reassurance and instruction, helping communities navigate a world in which illness could strike suddenly and unpredictably. Markets, while quieter than before, still functioned with careful order. Merchants arranged goods methodically, exchanges were brief, and social interactions were measured. Life persisted, even if in a slower, more deliberate pace. Communities learned to survive within the rhythm dictated by the plague, finding strength in small routines and careful practices. Evenings brought quiet reflection. Fires glowed warmly in homes. Families gathered together, and whispered conversations offered comfort. People shared memories of those who had passed and celebrated small victories, the recovery of a neighbor, the safe return of a child from the fields, the harvest of a modest crop. In these moments, resilience and hope quietly flourished alongside grief. The natural world continued its steady presence. Rivers flowed, trees swayed in the wind, and the stars shone clearly above. Their constancy offered reassurance, reminding people that even in times of fear and loss, some rhythms remained unchanged. Hour by hour, Europe adapted to the presence of the Black Death. Fear, loss, and uncertainty were constant companions, but so too were care, adaptation, and quiet resilience. Life, even under the shadow of one of history's most devastating plagues, continued, hour by hour, step by step. Europe had endured, and humanity, though tested, began to emerge with lessons learned in patience, care, and survival.
The Black Death had left its deep, quiet mark across Europe. Towns, villages, and countryside alike bore the memory of loss, yet life, slowly and deliberately, had begun to find a fragile rhythm once more. Communities had adapted, families had persevered, and humanity had endured under the long, subtle shadow of the plague. Families rose with careful awareness. Every task was approached with attention and care, feeding animals, tending fields, preparing meals. Children, still watched closely, began to explore safely, learning the balance between caution and curiosity. Life, while forever changed, continued with a quiet resilience that had been honed over countless days and nights. Healers remained essential figures in society. Their steady hands, calm voices, and gentle guidance had taught communities to navigate the new reality of life with sickness ever present. Even in the face of uncertainty, these acts of care had made survival possible. The lessons they imparted about hygiene, observation, and compassion would echo for generations to come. Markets and towns slowly reawakened. Though interactions remained measured, the rhythm of trade and daily exchange returned. People began to venture further, speak more openly, and reconnect with neighbors while maintaining awareness of the invisible presence that had transformed their world. The soft pulse of community life returned, step by step, hour by hour. Evenings became times of reflection, remembrance, and gentle celebration of survival. Families gathered by the glow of fires, sharing stories of those who had been lost and of those who had endured. Songs were hummed softly, prayers whispered, and hope quietly nurtured. In these small rituals, people found the courage to move forward, honoring the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. Nature, untouched by human fear, continued its steady, enduring cycles. Rivers flowed with the same gentle persistence. Winds rustled through the trees, and stars shone over a world forever changed, yet still constant in its beauty. These natural rhythms offered reassurance and continuity,
reminding humanity that even after great trials, life continues. The Black Death had shaped Europe hour by hour, town by town, heart by heart. Its quiet presence had forced adaptation, care, and reflection. But through it all, the resilience of people endured. They learned to live with uncertainty, to care with intent, and to preserve life even in the shadow of an invisible threat. And so the continent began its slow, careful recovery. Life would never be exactly the same, but it persisted. Communities rebuilt, traditions evolved, and the lessons of endurance and compassion passed from one generation to the next. Even in the darkest hours, humanity's quiet strength had prevailed. The plague had left its mark, but it had also revealed the remarkable capacity of people to adapt, endure, and continue, hour by hour, step by step, moment by moment.